Hey everyone, before we dive into today's episode, I want to tell you about an upcoming event in San Diego that you won't want to miss if you're in the vicinity. On Friday, March 21st, Talking San Diego, the series of live conversations we inaugurated last year, will be welcoming Maureen Dowd, the esteemed Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times columnist, for a conversation anchored in her new book, Notorious. For tickets and more information, visit talkingsandiego.net. Welcome to Talking Feds, a roundtable that brings together prominent former federal officials and special guests for a dynamic discussion of the most important political and legal topics of the day. I'm Harry Littman. Our episode this week is dedicated to foreign policy, and it couldn't be more timely. While much of the country, perhaps lawyers especially, have been consumed with Trump's all-out assault on constitutional norms and the rule of law at home, he's been no less destructive abroad, wielding his sledgehammer against the global alliances that have anchored U.S. security and influence for some 75 years. Trump yanked the rug out from under Ukraine, peddling vicious lies about the country and its president. He's treated our closest allies like disobedient school children, demanding they, quote, do more while he cozies up to Vladimir Putin. And he seems unconcerned, if not outright complacent, about China's amassing the military and economic power to challenge the U.S. for global dominance. Trump's instincts run directly counter to the very values that have defined American leadership for decades. His foreign policy doesn't seem to be guided by democracy, diplomacy, or even strategic strength. Rather, it seems to be driven by an almost reflexive admiration for autocrats and strongmen. The more repressive, the better. In just a few short weeks, he's done serious damage, pushing the U.S. toward a dark new vision of power, one that looks disturbingly like the regimes he admires most. The net effect is to chill relations with allies and warm them to former adversaries. Just as with his relentless attacks on democracy at home, the damage from Trump's reckless foreign policy spree could be profound and long-lasting. Even after Trump, the U.S. may find it extremely difficult to reclaim its leadership role on the world stage. To assess the seemingly cataclysmic overnight changes in U.S. foreign policy and what they portend for the stability and prosperity of the free world and the U.S.'s role in it, we welcome three phenomenal foreign policy experts and scholars. And they are Michael McFaul, a professor of political science, director of the Freeman Spogli Institute, and Hoover Senior Fellow, all at Stanford University, and of course also the former U.S. ambassador to Russia from 2012 to 2014. His terrific Substack is called McFaul's World, and he has a new book coming out this October called Autocrats versus Democrats, China, Russia, and the New Global Order. Welcome back to Talking Feds, Michael McFaul.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Anne Applebaum, a staff writer for The Atlantic and a Pulitzer Prize-winning historian. Her latest book is Autocracy, Inc., and her Substack, much recommended, is called Open Letters. Anne, thanks for joining. From Warsaw, I believe, yes?
Yep, I'm in Warsaw.
All right. And a first-time guest, Steve Sestanovich, a senior fellow for Russian and Eurasian Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations and a professor emeritus at Columbia University's School of International and Public Affairs. He is the author of Maximalist, America and the World from Truman to Obama. So pleased to welcome you.
A pleasure to be here.
All right, let's start with the stunning and treacherous reversal of policy with respect to Ukraine and Russia. It's always seemed clear, even to laypersons, that Trump has a strange affinity for Vladimir Putin that would lead him to lean in Russia's direction more than Biden did. But his announcements this week constituted a breathtaking and complete reversal of our policy, complete with savage lies about Ukraine and its president, denigration of European allies. Did we, or for that matter, Europe or Zelensky, expect this profound and comprehensive a turnabout on the new president's part?
Yeah, to be honest, I expected it. I mean, I don't know that I expected exactly this formulation of words, but Trump has been telling us since the 1980s that he doesn't like U.S. alliances. He took out a newspaper ad in 1987 following a trip to Moscow, interestingly, in which he denounced American alliances and said we should withdraw from them. He wrote in one of his books, that we should withdraw from Europe. He's criticized American involvement even in the Second World War. He was the person who blocked for many months, if you'll remember last year, a congressional bill on spending in Ukraine. He was known to have prevented, if you remember, there was a deal where there was going to be a border deal plus some money for Ukraine. And that was a big bipartisan compromise. He was the one who blocked it, or he helped to block it. So we've known that he has these feelings for a long time. I mean, the oddity of the current moment is that just a few weeks ago, he was sounding different. He made some statements about Russia being the big loser and why hadn't they won the war? And, maybe we need to bully them to stop. And, we're going to increase sanctions and build up Ukraine. Then he's made this abrupt shift back to his previous language, which is about Putin being a great and stable leader and Ukraine being a pathetic loser and so on.
And Zelensky being a dictator and having 4% support. I hadn't seen that before.
Yeah, in the context of dealing with Putin, to call Zelensky a dictator is deeply bizarre. I mean, not only is Zelensky elected, but Ukraine is a free country where people say what they want. And all you have to do is go to Kiev and you hear it, and you can hear plenty of criticism of Zelensky in public and private. So it's not a restrained society in that way at all. Local government is very important in Ukraine. I mean, it's a real grassroots democracy in that sense, and that's been very important in the defense of Ukrainian territory, as anybody will tell you. Russia is a brutal dictatorship. It's not just a dictatorship. It's one where certainly there are people informing on one another. If they hear them saying things critical of the war in public, criticizing the war is illegal. Civil society has been destroyed in Russia. There are almost no independent institutions of any kind. I mean, one that used to exist called the Mothers of Soldiers Society has been disbanded. Historical societies have been disbanded. I mean, there's almost nothing now except the state and state power. And in that context, to say that Ukraine is a dictatorship or that Ukraine is corrupt compared to the levels of corruption in Russia is outrageous. And the only thing I can think of is that it must have come from his conversation with Putin, maybe from connections to people around Putin. There seem to be some younger Russians who are talking through others for the last few weeks. And it's possible that explains it.
And not just outrageous characterizations, but total whoppers, factual. He has
factual
4%
lies,
support. Yeah. I see a lot of head nods from both Steve and Michael. Please go for it.
Yeah. One other factor that would explain the switch from saying we got to put more sanctions on Russia and give more military aid to Ukraine, in addition to talking to Putin, which fits the Trump believes the last person he's talked to rule, he did send his Treasury Secretary to Kiev last week in order to get a deal to get control of Ukrainian natural resources. And Zelensky said, no way. Actually, Zelensky said, let's talk about it. But I think for Trump, the rejection of this deal, which seemed to feed the businessman's interest in getting the Ukrainians to pay for the aid that they've been given.
At fire sale prices, by the way, yeah.
But not just fire sale prices. I mean, Steve, tell the details of the deal is incredible. The deal was give us half of all your natural resources forever. But also, by the way, completely unenforceable. It was just a piece of paper that said this. And who can sign that?
Yeah, I've been talking to Ukrainian officials about this, and they tend to think that was a big factor in the change in Trump's outlook. But I'd give the Putin phone call equal billing here. There are two things that always matter Trump. And that one is the bottom line, and the other is the fascination with dictators.
I actually do not think it was the rejection of that document that led to Trump going off. Anne and I were in Munich several days ago. I talked to some very senior Zelensky officials who were in the meeting with Vice President Vance. And the sense I got talking to them is that they were ready to sign this agreement. They had no choice. Their hope was that it was just going to be some stupid 2-page document with no details and would give the chapeau, the cover, to then do the negotiations. And they were basically told that by the vice president and the secretary of state, from what I understand. Just sign the stupid document so that we can do our work. I think it's this conversation with Putin that you two were alluding to, where he just went off on this tangent because he does want Putin. This for him is about establishing a relationship with Putin. His team flew to Saudi Arabia to restart relations with Russia, of which the peace negotiations was one point in their conversations. Yuri Ushakov, tragically somebody I used to know, he was still negotiating when I was in the government 4,000 years ago, and it was the same damn team. Lavrov, Ushakov, he's a very careful guy, as Steve knows well. He does not pop off like people like me do or Donald Trump. He said, we are here to reestablish U.S.-Russian relations. And only 3 sentences down did he even mention Ukraine. So I think that's what this is about. And then when he attacked President Zelensky, again, obviously in things that are not true, just so we're all on the same page, Russia invaded Ukraine. We all know that. And we don't get to argue about facts, folks. Even the president of the United States doesn't get to have his own facts. And he's not at a 4% approval rating. There's data to show that. He has a higher approval rating than our president right now. But I think it was the action reaction. And then Zelensky reacted to that. And maybe that wasn't the wisest thing. I'm told all the time, don't feed the trolls when I'm on Twitter, whatever it's called these days. But I think he felt he had to. And then that's when things just went really badly. And it feels like they've now recovered it. But the second thing I want to say, to build on things that were said earlier, of course, I expected this was going to be Trump's move. I tried to tell my friends in Ukraine, some of whom were quite excited about President Trump winning the election. They were really tired dealing with the Biden administration. They thought at least you can shake things up and do a deal. And we all want a deal. They're exhausted. What I did not expect, I want to say honestly, I did not expect that Trump and his team would be so bad at negotiating. I've got his book right here. I've been reading this book, Art of the Deal, fairly close.
God bless you.
I'm trying to figure out the strategy here.
Yeah, I mean, you pointed out as a matter of tactics, forget strategy, this is just ridiculous, giving every concession before you get to the table to Putin, right?
Right, and we could go through the list if we want, but I honestly don't understand the strategy. Unless it's that they actually don't care about getting a deal and that they just want to, Trump wants to fly to Saudi Arabia, meet with Putin, show the world that we have a peace deal. And then they email it to Zelensky and say, sign. And then Trump can say, hey, I gave them a peace deal and they didn't take it. And then he walks away. I hope that's not true. And I most certainly am convinced that's not what his Secretary of State and National Security advisor want. But otherwise, it's kind of difficult to understand what their negotiating strategy is.
All three of you have mentioned this big call with Putin from last week, which really was extraordinary. I want to just stick a little bit longer with the local situation in Russia and Ukraine. So let's assume that he adheres to his anti-Ukraine stance, even tries to isolate Zelensky. Do you take it as a certainty that Ukraine will be steamrolled? Is there a viable scenario where Europe steps up? So leaving aside the possibility you've just mentioned, Michael, that some semi-adults in the room in the U.S. will prevail, if he really stays with it, any hope for Ukraine?
So Ukraine I'm told, is well armed for, depending on who you talk to, the next 6 months or the next year. The war has changed a lot, and some of the heavy equipment that Ukrainians got from the U.S. and from Europe initially and that they thought they needed has turned out to be less useful. It turns out that tanks aren't very useful in this particular war. It's a drone war. The Ukrainians have the most advanced drone teams on the planet. I have been in the underground room where a part of one of the battalions runs banks of screens all around the room where they can see the whole front line and where they control different drone operations there. They now make their own drones. They made more than 1 million last year. They're probably 4 times that many this year. And it's not just the physical drones aren't really what's important. It's the software that they've invented. Some comes from the US, from Palantir and other companies and European companies as well. Some of it is they've created on the spot. So it's not as if they have nothing or that they won't be able to keep fighting. I mean, they will. The big questions are around intelligence and communications. If the US continues to provide that, then they will be able to go on fighting. Nobody I've talked to in Ukraine feels like there's about to be a collapse at the front line. They have moved forward. They've taken some more Russian territory. I've lost track of how many months. This battle for Pokrovsk has never really happened. We kept hearing about how Pokrovsk was about to fall. It didn't. Russians don't really have the troop numbers to take a city because it's much more difficult to take a city than it is to take some empty territory. And they don't seem to have the ability to do that right now. I mean, they'd have to recruit a lot more people and they'd have to be willing to take a lot more, even more than the hundreds of Russians who die every day. So it's not that desperate. I mean, it's more a question of degrees. And remember also that the Ukrainians if there's no deal and there's no ceasefire and there's no ultimate security plan, then the Ukrainians will not stop fighting because they don't really have an alternative because Russian occupation means they all die anyway. You're between a rock and a hard place. So there are a lot of variables there. I don't want to sound either too optimistic or too pessimistic because it would depend what a U.S. cutoff meant. And I don't know what exactly that would mean.
There are a lot of uncertainties in those variables that Anne is talking about. The Biden administration sent a lot of weapons out the door at the end, but they chose not to use all their authority that they had. And I think in retrospect, that was a mistake. The question of economic assistance is going to be important, and it will matter what attitude the Europeans take on that front in particular. The Europeans have to make a choice. You've got Macron and Starmer coming to Washington next week. And for them, the issue is how far from Trump do they want to seem? How big an argument do they want to have? Zelensky fought back in public against Trump this week. And as Mike said, there were people telling him, don't do that. Are the French and the British going to be more cautious? And are they going to reduce their assistance to the Ukrainians? As this unfolds, the other problem that the Ukrainians have to deal with is their own internal politics. The immediate effect of this has been to boost Zelensky. He's much more a kind of national hero, with even his political opponents rallying behind him and saying, what do you mean we have to have elections in the middle of martial law? But there is deep exhaustion there, and the political situation can play out in unpredictable ways that just weaken their unity. I'm not predicting that. I think they have been incredibly heroic and resilient.
Amazing, right? Yeah.
But still, one should not, count on that lasting forever. Every country has a breaking point, and the Ukrainians have really been pushed hard.
You've all mentioned this important call between Trump and Putin last week, kind of an extraordinary moment that seems to have effectively shattered 3 years of Western efforts to isolate Russia. And if I can go back to you, because you in your great piece in The Atlantic, you wrote, for 8 decades, our alliances with other democracies have been the bedrock of American foreign policy, trade policy, cultural influence. Our investments in allies' security helped keep the peace. You talk about Germany and Japan. And of course, we prospered as a result. If this is the sort of new tentpole of American foreign policy, this U.S. Putin or Russia rapprochement, what does it mean, as you see it, for the whole broader international order and everything that, has been put in place and we've had taken for granted since World War II.
So first of all, I don't know that we've had a full-scale rapprochement yet. It's true that there is something much broader happening. And again, I'll refer to what I said at the beginning, that Trump has had an animus towards allies and alliances 50 years. I mean, it goes back a very long way. He tried during his first term to leave NATO. He was in a car with John Bolton going to a NATO summit. He turned to him and said, this is according to John Bolton, he said, "John, let's make history today. Let's leave NATO." And John said, "No, Mr. President, that would be a bad idea." And they got Jim Mattis on the phone. It's where they stopped him. So this is something that he has felt deeply. And where it comes from, we can only speculate. But what the other difference between his first term and now is that he has now acquired around him a community of people who also feel that way, of whom J.D. Vance is a representative, but there are others in the tech world and in other parts of the MAGA coalition who also want the U.S. to withdraw. They don't feel any special affinity for Europe, in particular. We could also talk about the Asian alliances. They don't put democracy at the center of U.S. foreign policy. They don't feel a special affinity for other liberal democracies. In fact, the other thing that happened last week was that J.D. Vance went to the Munich Security Conference, which I was there with Mike. It was a big room full of generals and people who worry about security policy. Essentially, he said, "I don't care about your security." He changed the subject and he talked about what terrible democracy Europe is. And he cited a series of mischaracterized incidents and so on. He also telegraphed, it wasn't all that clear, although he then met with the leader. He telegraphed support for the German far right, which I would note, apart from everything else, is a pro-Russian party, openly pro-Russian, also historically openly anti-American. You have also had Elon Musk telegraphing support for other pro-Russian parties. There was in Vance's speech a hint of sympathy for a really wacky Romanian presidential candidate who is also pro-Russian, also a believer in mystical healing and other things, but never mind. So you see, suddenly you could imagine a U.S. foreign policy in which we are no longer aligned with other democracies, but we support radical movements in other places. And that makes the U.S. just a completely different country. It makes it a different country for our allies in Europe or Japan. It makes us not aligned with democracies, and we are potentially aligned with dictatorships or with other radical movements around the world. In a way, the attack on USAID, although it's a complicated story, is going to have a similar effect. As the U.S. withdraws its humanitarian aid programs from around the world. I was just on the phone actually before we started talking with a woman who runs a very big refugee feeding program in Africa. And she started the phone call by bursting into tears. So the drama of the U.S. withdrawing from places where we were seen as a beneficent, friendly, at the very least, pro-civil society, pro-good feelings power, this era is over. And that's going to be I think it's even too early to calculate what the impact will be on how America is perceived, how our allies act. It will mean all the alliances need to begin thinking differently about how they protect themselves, how they think about trade with the U.S., how they think about U.S. tech companies, maybe. Unless there's a major reversal or retrenchment, which it doesn't feel like there will be, we're in a moment of radical change. It's really radical international change in how America's perceived, how America's alliances are held together.
I agree with everything that Anne has said, but I want to give it an extra spin because Trump would not be all that unhappy with your description, Anne.
I know.
He would say, all right, we're not going to be seen as beneficent. To hell with beneficence. But I think there's something deeper and more problematic in what he's doing. And that is, this is weakening America. I think if you look at the international distribution of power, you would have to say that America, for all that there's talk about brandishing our power and imposing our will, and the New York Times piece, Bret Stephens and Masha Gessen talks about coercive conquest and transactional empire building. I think that is grossly exaggerated. The real transformation here that can't be separated from the loss of soft power is the American role in the world is just going to be less. And the American ability to get its way is going to be less. Trump thinks it's going to be greater. But the reality is, the United States has, in the way that Anne says at the beginning of her excellent Atlantic piece, America has benefited from its network of alliances. It has been a network that none of its rivals has been able to match and has given a kind of automatic credibility to anything that the United States wants. When that's not the case, when the United States is just by itself, then what the United States wants isn't automatically translated into action. Other countries do not necessarily snap to attention. You, in fact, have to use a lot more power in order to get your way. And I think what we're going to discover is that what Donald Trump is doing is making America weak again.
And the benighedness of it all. USAID is a really good example.
Oh, let me mention one thing about that, Harry. Do you know who the single biggest recipient of USAID money is? By a mile, Ukraine. Very worrisome.
And the total budget, people, I think, seem to think it's 25%, it's 1%.
Analytically, I have no disagreement with Anne and Steve. That we're analyzing the problem right now. I completely agree. But I'm not ready prescriptively to accept this as the future of America forevermore. And I think we need to be very careful about that. I'm writing a book right now, Harry. I'm actually finishing on Monday, and I'm taking an hour out of my time to be with you here. My editor would not be pleased. It's called Autocrats versus Democrats, and it's about lessons from the Cold War for how to deal with China and Russia today. Book will come out in October, and I'm not sure what side the Trump administration will be in that fight between autocrats and Democrats, right? That is deeply troubling for all the reasons we just discussed. And I agree, we are making America weak, and bully diplomacy, it'll work against countries like Panama and Colombia. It's not going to work against China. And there's another power out there, including for our European allies, by the way, talking to them in Munich, where they're going to say, well, the hell with you, America. If you're leaving us, we're not going to go along on all your stupid disentanglement, decoupling stuff with China. They're not going to be there with us. That's a recipe for disaster if you care about America and our security and our prosperity. But let's not get ahead of our skis, folks. We are not in a monarchy right now. This is not a dictatorship in the United States. And if you look at what the American people think, they don't agree with Mr. Trump and all of his kooky ideas. On Russia, Quinnipiac poll, not exactly a leftist liberal poll, by the way. 81% of Americans said they don't trust Putin. 9% said they trust Putin. Trump is out of touch with his community on that one. Allies, the polling data is overwhelmingly clear what the American people think about allies. So he may want to try to do these things, but I'm here to tell you, I'm going to fight him every single moment of the way. And we just shouldn't think that this is the end of America. This reminds me a lot of the way people talked in the 1970s about America. Remember when Marxist-Leninist regimes were marching all over the world and we had all our problems at home, and it was just a matter of time until the communists took over. 15 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed. So the analytics I agree with, but it is not inevitable that we go down this dangerous, horrific path that Mr. Trump wants us to go on. Well, he doesn't get to decide everything.
Look, you've been in the ebb and flow of things from 12 to 14 in Russia. Then we had Trump 1. Here's the argument you hear about our allies and whether they will be, in fact, seduced by China. It's like, fool me once, shame on, but fool me twice. That people, even if the ship rights and the Trump administration goes not so extreme, the rational vantage point of the world's democracies and our erstwhile allies will be, Jesus, United States, now you've done it again. Why should we have this kind of long-range investment? We just saw J.D. Vance, the, apparent inheritor of the mantle, talk this trash in Europe. So leaving aside what I very much hope, and thank God for your expertise, is the actual outcome, isn't the immediate effect today, here and now on Europe to be very unsettled just because, this may not be certainly not a one-off, and it may not be a two-off?
Yes, of course. I was in Munich for, that speech, and that speech was shocking. And, we all debated whether ever a speech as shocking as this. People talked about Putin's in 2007. I don't think so. And in terms of the crisis of the transatlantic relationship, I know I'm speaking on a panel here with historians, and I'm not one, so I'll defer to them. But yeah, the French pulled out of NATO. Yes, we had a crisis in the 80s with the Pershings. This feels fundamentally bigger and different. I want to acknowledge that. I just don't want to say that it's all over now. We're just in 3 weeks of it. But the positive side of that, at least in my conversations, I'll be curious what Anne felt in Munich. The Europeans are like, okay, we got to get our act together, and we got to do things amongst ourselves. And that's a good thing. I'm not against that. I always thought it was ridiculous that we always were, you got to spend your money in NATO and not in your other places. That was a peculiar position that previous administrations have. And if Europe emerges from this stronger, that's good for America. And the renewal process of our NATO alliance might happen among more balanced terms. So maybe that could have a positive effect without in any way understating just the shock that we experienced with those speeches, and the shock that the world have experienced with what Mr. Trump said. And one last thing, in case I forget it, but I really want to make sure I say it. When J.D. Vance, by the way, we had all this mess. What did Hegseth say? What's our position? He could have used that speech to clean up what the American position was on everything, but especially on Ukraine. And he chose to lecture them about how bad their democracies are. And just, Harry, I don't need to tell you, just imagine how what that sounds like to Europeans sitting in the room, given all of our troubles with our democracy right now, given the fact that this is the guy that ran on, with the president.
And he's a punk. He just is a punk.
Well, I'm going to let you say that. Yeah. But
I'll say it here.
They stormed the parliament, and then they let all those guys off. And somehow we're going to lecture our British colleagues and Italians and the Romanians about their problems. But what really was galling to me, he talked about opposition, suppression, and all that. And he never mentioned Belarus, and he never mentioned Russia. And in that room was Yulia Navalny. Her husband was killed a year before because he actually was really repressed by this regime, not some kind of weird thing that he was talking about. In the room was Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. She hadn't spoken to her husband for 2 years, and that he didn't have enough sense to add just one sentence about that is deeply disturbing to me, about their competency, not just about what they're seeking to achieve.
All right, it is now time for a spirited debate brought to you by our sponsor, Total Wine and More. Each episode, you'll be hearing an expert talk about the pros and cons of a particular issue in the world of wine, spirit, and beverages.
Thank you, Harry. In today's spirited debate, we dig up the dirt on the agave plant to find out the difference between tequila and mezcal. So first things first, tequila is a type of mezcal, much like bourbon is a type of whiskey. In general, tequilas are mezcals, but not all mezcals are tequilas. Allow me to explain. Tequila can only come from the blue agave plant in specific regions of Mexico, like the region of Jalisco, where the city of Tequila is located. No coincidence there. Mezcal, however, can be made from many varieties of agave, specifically from the heart of the agave, known as the piña. The distillery process for tequila and mezcal is also different. Tequila is produced by steaming the blue agave and then distilling it in copper stills for a toasty, clean taste. On the other hand, mezcal, which appropriately means oven-cooked agave, is cooked in earthen pits with wood and charcoal before being distilled in clay pots. No wonder mezcal, which is typically consumed straight, has more of a smoky, earthy taste. Of course, the best way to get to know the differences between tequila and mezcal is to pick up a bottle of each from your Total Wine & More and pour hundreds of years of tradition right into your glass. Cheers!
Thanks to our friends at Total Wine and More for today's A Spirited Debate. So here we are smack in the middle of the Munich Security Conference. Let's just move to that and in general, where things stand with our erstwhile allies. Trump categorically precludes Ukraine's joining NATO. I mean, he seems to have this obsession with sort of thinking of allies as they're cheating us and wanting to squeeze them for a little bit more money and that. So this sort of native distrust. What was brought home to you by the whole performance?
Look, Europeans are asking themselves, what does it mean to be an ally? And it isn't just the nuclear deterrent component, that in extremis, if the Russians come storming across the continent, the United States will, use its ICBMs in retaliation. It's also consultation. It's a affirmation in a regular way of common purpose. It's about shared resource commitments. Mike is right. The Europeans haven't done as much, although they have increased their defense spending since the war started more than the United States. And that's something people forget. I'm not sure they even know it. And above all, it's about joint activity. And what you have seen in the past week is that the administration is really not willing to do any of those things. They haven't talked about how they're going to pursue the Ukraine end game. They haven't talked about how to mobilize economic support so Ukraine can survive in a post-war environment. They haven't talked about dealing with Ukraine's security. They have really acted as though we just don't have to tell you any of this. And the result is, I think you're going to have much stormier meetings when the French and the British come to town. You're going to have much more in the way of public defiance. You're going to discover that European leaders benefit by challenging the United States. Remember, Scholz, who has been a docile figure in this entire story, stood up and denounced Trump for the way he was handling Zelensky. So you're going to have much more division. You're going to have more open challenges to American leadership. It isn't just a matter of doubting whether the United States will come to Europe's defense. It's all of the other elements that make up an alliance that are at risk now. This has been such a public relations disaster for the administration that you figure the likes of Susie Wiles and the people in the White House are saying, oh my God, how do we clean this one up? How do we get the president back on his meds so that we can go forward with the other things we need to be able to do? The idea, and I wonder whether Mike and Anne agree with this, the idea that this has been, a plus for Trump seems to me way off. He has looked like a blundering fool.
Well, at least in the international community, right? And Macron convenes an emergency meeting that I'm sure wasn't lost on folks. I wanted to ask you, Anne, if I could, because all three of you made the point that we make suppositions or our best kind of surmises, but I don't want to paint you into a corner and maybe things work out better. You did make a striking statement in the wake of Munich, however, and you'd been to many, and you said the Trump administration is now bringing the post-World War II era to an end. Do you sort of stand behind that categorically? Is it a kind, something we need to chew on, or is that where we are now?
Oh, yeah. No. I mean, the era when the U.S. operated through a network of alliances and institutions, when the U.S. was a predictable and reliable power, actually, regardless of whether it was a Democratic or a Republican president, at least in some areas. Maybe it didn't feel that way at the time, but if you go back and read Reagan's speeches, they don't seem crazy or radical or out of line. You could compare them with JFK's speeches, and it feels like there's a single line between them. And so that era is over. I do agree with Mike, and as I've said already, that we can stop some of this, but I don't think we're ever going to return to the moment when we ensure that kind of stability. One of the reasons I wrote that is I I really want American allies to see it and hear it and understand it, and also understand that that's what they want. J.D. Vance wanted to do that. Was the purpose of giving that kind of speech, in a room of people who deal with things like ships cutting the cables in the Baltic Sea and Russian sabotage, and Russian cyber attacks. They have real problems, real defense problems all the time. J.D. Vance made a kind of fictional speech, that was part of an online conversation. And everyone got the message, regardless of what was in the speech. And so that is over. And it's really important that allies adjust. I do think the Europeans got the message. The problem for Europe, Europe has more people, and depending on how you count, but is more GDP than the United States. That's all true. It has big defense industries. Each country has an army. The trouble is that Europe's security has operated via NATO. And Europe did cede leadership of NATO to the United States. And that's what the United States wanted Europe to do. And that gave the United States a lot of power to make decisions. It was Europe followed America to Afghanistan. Europe followed America to Iraq. Europe was with America in all kinds of crises, actually, over the last several decades, not just those two. And the U.S. got that aid and legitimacy from those alliances. And I think that is now over. But what it means is that Europe is kind of like a headless chicken. All the ingredients to be a military power are there, but there aren't institutions to organize it. There's a Supreme Allied Commander NATO, and he's an American. So if you take him out, who's the Supreme Allied Commander? And that's really the problem right now, more than anything else. It's not that Europe can't keep up industrially or scientifically or in any other way. It's that they don't have one thing about the European Union is that it's not a federation. It's a confederation. That means that they haven't really pooled their power. There isn't a single leader. There isn't an elected government. And that's how people have wanted it. But in order to have a military, you need someone who's going to command the military and give the orders and tell the army what to do. And who is that person? We still have this age-old problem of there being no person who you can call in the middle of the night if you want to talk to Europe. That may be something that they can work out. There are a lot of ideas floating around right now. There's an idea of creating a defense bank, of creating a fund. I think some of that will happen. There may be some military activities that can be done over the skies in Ukraine and so on. There are some countries who are talking about sending troops. That feels premature because until there is a real ceasefire, hard to know exactly what the troops would do. But what's missing is the mechanism of control. And maybe they'll come up with that in the next few weeks or months, but that's the hard part, not the other stuff.
I agree with Anne about institutions, but Europe does have one other liability that is dragging them down and keeping them from addressing this crisis quite as robustly as they might. And that is, there's been an economic slowdown in Europe, and the EU does not feel like the sort of hugely successful economic powerhouse that they did 25 years ago. And that's made a difference. One other way of sort of thinking about the change in the international order, 30 years ago, Jacques Chirac, who was president of France at the time, said, as a criticism of Bill Clinton in his Balkans policy, said the position of leader of the free world is vacant. And that was a hugely stinging insult. The idea that the president of the United States could be accused of having vacated the job of leader of the free world meant that in the cabinet meetings that followed, they thought, oh my God, how do we show we really are the leader of the free world? If European leaders say that today, President Trump's reaction is going to be, yeah, so what's your point?
I agree analytically with everything. And I think Anne's point about uncertainty is the real killer, right? I kept saying to my European friends and my Ukrainian friends last week, hang in there. We just got to get to the midterms and then things will change. I'm not confident in predicting that, but I'm trying to achieve that, right? So I want to keep pivoting between analysis and prescription, but it's the uncertainty that will change things. But that said, I just want to emphasize that the American people are not, they voted for the price of eggs, folks. They didn't say we want to abdicate to be the leader of the free world. They didn't say we want to get in bed with Putin. They didn't say we wanted to pull out of NATO. There's no empirical data to support that. And Steve, you've written about overreach, right? And pulling back. I think these guys are overreaching. Americans don't want to buy or take over Greenland. They don't want Canada to be the 51st state. They're not even interested in spending their money on the Panama Canal. And at a certain point, this is going to have to become a bigger political issue here at home. And Harry, I've been spending a lot of time with Democrats in the Congress over the last couple of weeks. And I think they have not got their act together yet. But just last night with a group out here in California, and I won't name names, but we have some prominent people who have been in leadership positions from time to time out here. Their feeling is we just got to get the guy down to below 45. And once he's below 45, then all of our feckless Republican friends who are just scared to death of doing anything might start pushing back. And there's a pattern of that on other political issues in this country. You know better than I do. And that, to me, is the project right now.
Great point. And to your point, Michael, actually, you have this incredibly indolent and cowed Senate Republicans who have actually spoken up a peep or two about the whole Ukraine-Russia thing, have called out the lie of saying that they were. So there, to me, it represents some sense of like the American people, as you're saying, are not going to go for this. Let me ask one question about China, because you brought it up briefly, and there is this sense that like, actually in the Atlantic, it was a great article in the Atlantic, not by Anne Applebaum, that happens occasionally, and they ran a piece arguing that basically so much of what he's doing is eroding our status as the American power, and it's all going to be to the benefit of China. Could you sort of explain that a bit and tell me if you think that's a sound prognosis?
Obviously, the Chinese are watching American behavior very closely. Obviously, they understand that if the United States won't defend Ukraine, then they might not defend other countries or regions who are attacked. And the first one that comes to mind is Taiwan. That's the first point. The second point is the U.S. appearing to withdraw, the USAID, people and money disappearing from so much of the world. And some of that money, I've been particularly interested in what happened to humanitarian aid. It's true that some of that money went to democracy promotion or independent media. The Chinese will see that, and because they spend billions, let's just call it hundreds of millions of dollars every year on propaganda, on television, on media, on radio, all over Africa, all over Asia, and all over Latin America, hooked to their business deals, they will immediately see a vacuum that they can walk into. So I would say on those two areas alone, it looks like all to their advantage.
I met with a group of Chinese visitors yesterday, former officials, sort of senior think tank types, and I was struck by their hesitance in thinking about how to deal with the Trump administration. They sort of, are trying to figure out whether you go to them with a deal proposal, what's the way of trying to engage that will be productive. I would contrast that with the Russians. I mean, I think in some ways, the Russians really know what they want from Trump, and they have probably an unrealistic agenda, even from Trump's point of view, certainly from, every other responsible government in Europe. But they know what the shape of Europe's political and security architecture ought to be. I think the Chinese are a little more confused about that and not sure how to take advantage of what you might think is really a new opportunity for them. If I'm right that Trump is making America weak again, that's got to benefit the Chinese. But, they have a lot of their own problems, and that came through in a lot of the discussion yesterday. They are not, riding a wave of economic success themselves.
Yeah, and he does have this strength or instinct or something of keeping people off balance domestically, internationally, and that translates into certain kinds of capital. We're nearly out of time, and this is really in the area of speculation, but I wanted to at least try here to see if you have thoughts. So, one day, and I think it can't come too soon. Scholars will be trying to come to grips with what was Trump's foreign policy. Any sense of what they'll say? I don't even mean to, I've long since given up trying to psychoanalyze them, but what coherent theory will they try to map onto his erratic and impulsive series of actions? Will there ever be anything to say cogent about the Trump 2.0 foreign policy such as it was?
Harry, I think it's very clear. It's not incoherent what he wants. You think about all the big debates. I teach a course on American foreign policy here at Stanford. Isolationist versus engagement. He's more isolationist. Unilateralist versus multilateralist. Of course, he's the unilateralist in the extreme. Realist versus liberals. Do we care about the kinds of regimes and human rights abroad? Of course, he's in that realist camp. And now he's added an imperial desire and ambition. I don't think it's going to go anywhere. That's the Trump doctrine. And I hope it fails, because all those things, just to add on, I think you guys were being a little too kind in this US-China thing. I think this is catastrophic. If you're really worried that China is the threat of the 21st century, and I just finished writing a book about it, and you look at what are the sources of American power, we have economic power and military power. And I hope the Trump folks won't screw that up. I'm actually optimistic that that'll be there. But, Cold War versus now, allies. He's destroying that. Cold War versus now, the assistance stuff. USAID was created in 1961, and it wasn't just because we wanted to be nice people. It was about the Cold War struggle. He just took all that off the table. We were already behind the Chinese on this front, and now we're out of the game. That's done. But the last thing, and this is something Kennan said about containment, he said, as long as we're not fighting amongst ourselves, we'll be okay. I'm paraphrasing, but that's exactly what we're doing. We're fighting amongst ourselves, and that just allows the Chinese, so much running room. I agree with the cat. They got all the problems at home, and they're nervous about his craziness. I was just trading messages with a colleague of mine who's very pro Xi Jinping in Beijing. That's crazy man theory they're worried about, but mostly they're just stepping back, getting out of the way. When's the last time you heard Donald Trump give a speech about China? When's the last time you heard about any of these guys talking about the threat that is China? They're not, and Beijing is very happy about that.
Maybe there's an end. Thank you so much, Michael, Steve, Anne, and I hope it's not a terrible weekend for you, Michael. We look forward to the book.
It is going to be a terrible weekend for me, just so you know.
Yeah, exactly. Not too terrible, I said.
I think I saw Anne when she was finishing her book, it's always a terrible weekend before you finish your book.
You can see those pouches under the eyes and such. Anyway, hope very much that you'll be back and maybe the horizon will look a little sunnier. And thank you so much. Really, it's invaluable analysis. We're just focused so much back home, and the world seems as cataclysmic, if not more. Thanks so much, and see you next time. Thank you so much to Anne, Michael, and Steve. And thank you very much, listeners, for tuning in to Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts, and please take a moment to rate and review this podcast. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we are posting full podcast episodes, talking books, and bonus video content. Check us out on Substack now, at Talking Feds Substack, where I'll be posting a few bulletins a week trying to break down the various threats out there to constitutional norms and the rule of law. And you can still follow us on Twitter at Talking Feds Pod and look to see our latest offerings on Patreon. Talking Feds is a completely independent production, so if you like the work we do and are inclined to support the podcast, joining our Patreon is the best way to do it. And big new news, Talking Feds has joined forces with The Contrarian, a bold new media venture committed to reviving the diversity of opinion that feels increasingly rare in today's news landscape. Rest assured, we're still the same scrappy, independent podcast you've come to know and trust, just now linked with an ambitious and vital project designed for this pivotal moment in our nation's legal and political discourse. Find out more at contrarian.substack.com. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, as long as you need answers, the feds will keep talking. Talking Feds is produced by Catherine Devine. Our associate producer is Becca Havian. Sound engineering by Matt McArdle. Rosie Don Griffin, David Lieberman, Hamza Mahadrenathan, Emma Maynard, and Hallie Necker are our contributing writers, and production assistance by Akshaj Turbailu and Sebastian Navarro. Our music, as ever, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.